There's a certain kind of silence that only exists in the most expensive rooms. The kind where crystal glasses catch candlelight and every person at every table believes they are untouchable. Naomi Carter had worked inside that silence for 3 years, carrying trays and reading rooms and noticing things that no one expected a waitress to notice. She was invisible in the way that servers are always invisible to the powerful, and that invisibility on one particular Thursday night would turn out to be the most dangerous thing in the room. Not for her, for the man who thought he'd already won. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The restaurant was called Aurelius, and it had a way of making people feel like they belonged to something important just by walking through the door. Everything about the place was designed to communicate exclusivity without screaming it. The lighting was warm and low, the kind that made every face look like it was worth knowing. The tables were spaced generously apart, leaving enough distance for private conversations. The chairs were upholstered in deep charcoal velvet. The flowers on each table were fresh, not white peonies that were swapped out every morning. The wine list ran 22 pages. The menu had no prices printed on the guest copies. Naomi Carter had worked at Aurelius for 3 years, and she knew every inch of it the way you know a place you've spent more time in than your own home. She knew which floorboard near table 9 had a soft spot that made a faint creak if you stepped on it wrong. She knew that the bar refrigerator in the far left corner ran 2 degrees warmer than the others, which mattered when you were storing certain whites. She knew that Mr. Alderman at table 4 always wanted his sparkling water poured before he sat down, and that the couple who came in every Friday near the window always ordered the same thing, but pretended to study the menu for 12 minutes before doing so. She noticed things. That was just how she was built. Her co-workers had a running joke about it. Marcus, who worked the bar on weeknights, had once said that Naomi could walk into a room, spend 40 seconds in it, and tell you more about the people inside than their own mothers could. She'd laughed it off, but she hadn't denied it. It wasn't something she'd chosen. It was more like a habit that had grown so deep into her bones that she couldn't separate it from breathing. That Thursday evening in late October started like most evenings at Aurelius. The early dinner crowd was quiet, the kind of guests who came to eat well and leave before 9. By 7:30, the room had filled to its comfortable capacity, and the hum of conversation and soft jazz from the speakers gave the space its usual rhythm. Naomi was running the main floor. She had 3 tables in her section and one at the edge of her colleague Petra's section that Petra had asked her to cover for a few minutes while Petra handled the complaint in the back. It was routine. She picked up a tray, straightened her white apron, and moved through the room with the kind of efficiency that looked effortless because she'd practiced it into muscle memory. She was near the host station when the front door opened and Richard Hale walked in. She didn't know his name yet. She just noticed him. Most of the wealthy regulars who came to Aurelius carried themselves in one of 2 ways. Either they wore their money like armor. The way they moved communicated that they expected the room to adjust to them. Or they performed casualness, which was its own kind of performance. Both types were predictable once you'd seen them enough. You knew how they'd sit, what they'd order first, how long they'd take to acknowledge you when you came to the table. This man was neither. He was tall, well-dressed in a way that came from genuinely good taste rather than conspicuous labels. Dark jacket, no tie, a watch that was expensive but not showy. He scanned the room when he walked in, not nervously, not arrogantly, but the way someone does when they're assessing exits and sight lines out of habit. That scan took maybe 2 seconds, and then it was gone, replaced by something that looked like ordinary calm. He smiled at the host. He spoke briefly. He followed the host to a table near the center of the room, not by the window. Naomi clocked 2 other things almost immediately. First, there were 2 men seated at a small table near the coat area who had arrived a few minutes before him and who had not ordered food or drink. They were watching the room without appearing to watch it. Security, private, not restaurant. Second, there was already a man seated at his table, waiting for him. Medium height, sandy brown hair, a pale blue shirt. He rose and shook the newcomer's hand with the practiced warmth of someone who'd done a lot of handshaking in professional settings. She filed it all away and went back to her section. 20 minutes later, the host rotated table assignments, and the new arrivals fell into Naomi's rotation. She picked up her small notepad and made her way over. The man in the dark jacket was seated facing the room. Good instinct or training. His associate sat across from him, slightly relaxed in his chair, one hand resting near his wine glass. They were talking quietly when Naomi approached, and they paused in the way that confident people pause, without discomfort, just waiting. "Good evening," she said. "My name is Naomi. I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you both with something to drink?" The associate, she learned his name was Daniel Brooks, said he'd have red wine and gestured toward the list. The man in the dark jacket said, "Sparkling water for now." "Thank you." She noted that. Not unusual for someone who intended to keep his head clear. She took the wine order, noted the specific bottle Daniel indicated, and went to retrieve it. At the wine station, she pulled the bottle from the rack, checked the label, and reached for 2 glasses from the overhead shelf. Standard procedure. She set them on her tray, draped a clean cloth over her arm, and started back toward the table. She was halfway across the floor when she passed the service cart near the partition wall, the one they used to stage glassware for the tables in the far section. Someone had placed 2 glasses there, already poured with red wine, which was unusual. Glasses weren't typically pre-poured and left sitting. She slowed slightly, glancing at them, then continued to her table. She set 1 glass in front of Daniel and began to pour his wine. Then she picked up the second glass, the fresh one from her tray, and moved around to Richard's side of the table. She was about to set it down when she noticed it. It was subtle enough that most people would have walked right past it. Most people were not Naomi. There was a slight residue along the inside lower edge of the glass. Not visible from above, only visible at the specific angle she was at, with the restaurant lighting catching it the way it did. A faint film, almost like the glass had been rinsed but not quite cleaned. And beneath the layered scent of the wine she'd just opened, the warm, dark fruit of it, there was something else. A chemical note, sharp and thin, there for just a second and then gone. The kind of smell that most people would assume was the restaurant, or the air, or their imagination. She had spent 2 years in a nursing program before everything fell apart. She had spent those 2 years in hospital rooms and clinics and pharmacies. She knew what certain compounds smelled like. She knew what certain residues looked like. Her hands did not stop moving. Her expression did not change. She set that glass down at an empty spot at the edge of the table, as if she were setting down a placeholder, and reached smoothly to her tray for the second glass, the one she brought fresh from the station. She placed that one in front of Richard, adjusted the placement with a slight quarter turn, and straightened up without a pause. It had taken perhaps 4 seconds. Nobody in the room had turned to look. Daniel was checking his phone. The 2 security men near the coat area hadn't moved. But Richard had looked up. He'd caught the movement, not the detail of it, but the switch. He was watching her with the expression of a man who had trained himself not to react to things until he understood them. His eyes met hers for a moment. She held the look for exactly as long as was natural. Calm, professional. Then she gave a single, small nod, not the kind that means everything is fine, but the kind that means I see you and I'm handling it. And she stepped back. "Will you be having wine as well, sir?" she asked, voice even. "Not tonight," he said. He was still watching her, but his voice matched hers in its steadiness. "Of course." She folded her cloth over her arm. "If I can make one suggestion, I'd recommend sticking with bottled water this evening. We have a still option as well, if you prefer." It was a completely unremarkable thing for a server to say. Daniel didn't look up. Richard held her gaze for one more second. "Thank you," he said. "I'll do that." She moved away from the table with the same practiced ease she always moved with. Back to her station, back to her rotation, back to the rhythm of the room. But her mind was moving fast now. She was thinking about where those pre-poured glasses had come from, who had access to the wine station, who had been near the service cart in the last 20 minutes. She set the switched glass on the far end of the service cart, in the area where glasses were staged for return to the kitchen. She intended to flag it quietly to the manager after the rush. Not cause a scene, just pass it along and let it be handled. She didn't get the chance. 40 minutes later, one of the floor assistants, a young man named Caleb who sometimes helped clear tables and refill water, was moving through the service area at speed during a busy stretch. He grabbed what he thought was a clean glass of house wine sitting in the staging area. Naomi saw it happen from across the room and felt her stomach drop. She was too far away. She was in the middle of a table presentation on the other side of the restaurant. She took one step in his direction, but Caleb had already crossed the room, set the glass at a guest's table. A man seated alone at the two-top near the east wall, and moved on. The guest lifted the glass, took a sip. Within 2 minutes, he was gripping the edge of the table. Within 4 minutes, he was on the floor. The restaurant erupted. Not screaming, not movie chaos, but the sudden, breathless reorganization of a space where something has gone violently wrong. Guests pushed back from their tables. Someone shouted for a doctor. Petra was already on her phone, calling for an ambulance. The manager, a tall man named Gerald, came out of the back at a half-run. Richard Hale stood up slowly, quietly, and moved 2 steps back from his table. His eyes found Naomi across the room. He understood now, not fully, not yet, but enough. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. The police arrived 2 minutes after that. Gerald announced to the room that the restaurant was temporarily closed for the evening and asked guests to remain seated for a brief period while authorities conducted a routine inquiry. His voice was measured and professional. Nobody believed it was routine. The next hour was controlled pandemonium. Officers moved through the room, taking names and table numbers. The guest who'd collapsed, a man named Frederick Owens, mid-50s, alone for dinner, was loaded into the ambulance in serious condition. The police asked questions. Naomi answered them directly and factually, describing only what she had witnessed about the glass being misplaced and picked up by the floor assistant. She said nothing yet about the switch glass. She answered what she was asked. She kept her face calm. Richard Hale was escorted out a side entrance by his security team. He did not speak to police beyond providing identification. He moved through the exit the same way he'd moved through the entrance, quietly, assessing, composed. Naomi finished her interview with the officer, retrieved her coat and bag from the staff room, and was walking out toward the service exit when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Richard Hale was standing there alone. His security detail was visible through the window on the street, a few yards back, giving him just enough space. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You know what that was?" It wasn't a question. "I know what it looked like," she said. "The glass you moved." He kept his voice low. "That was meant for me." She didn't confirm it and didn't deny it. "The glass was contaminated. I removed it. That's all I can tell you for certain." He studied her. "Why didn't you say anything? Call someone." "I was going to flag it after the service rush," she said. "I didn't want to cause a panic over something I wasn't fully certain of. And I couldn't risk." She stopped. Adjusted. "I needed to be careful." He was quiet for a moment. The distant sound of the city moved around them. "Who are you?" he asked. Not unkindly. More like someone who's just realized a person is more than they appeared. "I'm a waitress," she said. "I've been one for 3 years." "That's not what I meant." She looked at him evenly. "I know." She pulled her coat a little tighter. "Someone wanted you quiet tonight, Mr. Hale," he said. She nodded slowly. "Someone wanted you quiet tonight, Mr. Hale. I don't know who. I don't know why. But the way your associate reacted when I changed that glass," she paused, "choosing what to give and what to keep. Pay attention to the people closest to you." She turned and walked toward the street. She didn't run. She didn't look back. But she walked fast, and she kept her eyes moving, and she didn't exhale properly until she was 2 blocks away and certain no one was following her. By the following morning, the story had made the local news. The headline on the city's main news site read, "Aurelius restaurant closes after guest falls ill. Health officials launch food safety investigation." The segment that ran on the morning broadcast described a possible issue with contaminated glassware from a supplier, pending lab analysis. A spokesperson for the city health department gave a brief statement expressing concern and promising a thorough review. There was no mention of poison, no mention of intent, no mention of Richard Hale. Naomi sat at her small kitchen table with her coffee going cold in front of her, watching the segment replay on her phone's news app for the 3rd time. The framing was careful, clinical. The kind of language that didn't raise alarms or invite follow-up questions from the general public. She'd seen enough of the world to recognize when a story was being managed. Someone had gotten to the narrative before the narrative could breathe. She set her phone down and looked across the kitchen to where Zuri was sitting at the low table by the window, eating cereal with total concentration, her small spoon moving with great deliberateness. She was 6 years old, and she approached most things, cereal, coloring, the business of waking up, as if they deserved her full attention. "You look worried," Zuri said, without looking up from her bowl. "I'm fine, baby," Naomi said. Zuri tilted her head slightly, still not looking up. "Your forehead does the thing." Naomi touched her own forehead. She'd been frowning without realizing it. "It's just new stuff," she said. "Boring grown-up things." Zuri accepted this with the mild skepticism of a child who has learned that grown-ups say that when they mean the opposite. Naomi took Zuri to school, came back to the apartment, and started thinking clearly. She hadn't slept well. Her mind had been running the events of the previous night on a loop. The glass, the smell, the switch, Daniel Brooks stiffening when she moved it, Richard Hale's eyes finding hers across the room as Frederick Owens collapsed. She kept returning to Daniel. The shift in his body when he'd seen her change the glass had been brief, a fraction of a second, but she'd been watching closely enough to catch it. It wasn't concern. It wasn't confusion. It was a specific, tight adjustment of a person recalibrating. She'd been around enough hospitals and enough difficult situations to know the difference between someone who was startled and someone who was recalculating. She thought about calling the police with a fuller version of what she'd seen. She thought about it for a long time, standing at her kitchen window with a second cup of coffee she didn't drink. And then she thought about what happened to people who came forward with information that someone powerful wanted suppressed. She thought about her father. She thought about Zuri's school pickup at 3:15. She decided to wait and see what the next 24 hours looked like. It didn't take long to show her something. Aurelius's management reached out to all floor staff that afternoon. A group message from Gerald, professionally worded, asking everyone to avoid speaking to press, to direct any inquiries to the restaurant's legal representative, and to report to a brief individual meeting with HR the following morning. Routine, it said. Standard procedure following an incident. Naomi read the message twice. Then she called her co-worker Petra. "Did yours say anything different from mine?" she asked. "Same message," Petra said. She sounded tense. "Gerald pulled me aside after, though. He said someone from Richard Hale's office had been in touch." Naomi was quiet. "Apparently they're doing their own look into it," Petra continued. "Security team or something." "Naomi, they're going to be looking at all of us." "I know," Naomi said. "Did you see anything last night? I mean actually see anything, not just—" "I'll tell you what I can when I know more," Naomi said. She kept her voice gentle but firm. "Don't talk to anyone you don't have to." "Okay." After she hung up, she sat on the edge of her bed and thought about what it meant to be a black woman in a city restaurant facing the security apparatus of a billionaire who might see her as a suspect before he remembered she was the one who'd helped him. She went to the meeting the next morning, answered questions carefully, and said nothing she hadn't already said to police. 2 days passed. The health department story faded. Frederick Owens was stable in the hospital, the official report attributing his collapse to an adverse reaction to contaminated wine, a supplier issue under investigation. Nothing else followed publicly. On the third evening, someone knocked on the door of Aurelius's back dining room while Naomi was finishing a short shift. Gerald came to find her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Someone asking for you," he said. "Front lounge. Says he just wants a word." She walked out to find Richard Hale seated alone at a corner table in the quiet lounge area. No security visible, a glass of water in front of him. He stood when she approached. She noted that. "Ms. Carter," he said, "I appreciate you coming out." "You know my name," she said. "I know quite a bit more than that," he said, and then immediately held up one hand. Not in a threatening way. "My team does background work. It's standard, and I apologize if it feels like an intrusion. Please sit down if you're comfortable." She sat, not because she was entirely comfortable, but because sitting down meant she could look at him directly and decide in real time whether she needed to leave. He was different from the restaurant night. Still composed, still careful. But there was something unguarded in the way he was sitting, like the composure was genuine rather than performed. He looked like a man who had spent 3 days thinking hard about something. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said. "What you did that night, that wasn't nothing. Frederick Owens is going to recover, but the doctors are very clear that the dose in that glass was not small." If I had, he stopped, looked at his water glass for a moment. "Thank you." "You're welcome," she said, because she meant it and there wasn't much else to add. "I also want to be honest with you," he said. "My security team initially looked at all the restaurant staff, including you. I want you to know that's no longer the case." "What changed?" she asked. "The lab results," he said, "and the surveillance from the service area." And he paused. "And the way you handled yourself that night. I've been doing this long enough to know when someone's acting and when they're not." She held his gaze. "So what do you want?" He was quiet for a moment. "I want to understand what you saw. Not for legal purposes. I'll handle that through the right channels. I just want to understand how you knew." She considered him. She had kept the fuller version to herself for 3 days. She'd been waiting to understand who she was handing it to. "The glass had residue along the inner base," she said. "The kind that comes from something added to it that didn't fully dissolve. And there was a smell beneath the wine. Sharp, brief. I only caught it for a second." She watched his face. "I spent 2 years in a nursing program. Before things changed." He was still listening. "I didn't finish," she said. "But you don't forget certain things once you've learned them. What certain compounds look like on surfaces. What they can smell like when they're masked. It's not complicated. It's just pattern recognition from training I never got to use for what it was meant for." He nodded slowly. Something in his expression shifted. Not pity, which she was relieved by, but something closer to respect. "What happened?" "To the training." She shook her head once lightly. "Family things. It doesn't matter now." She looked at him directly. "What matters is that someone put something in that glass. And based on the way your associate reacted when I switched it, you should think carefully about who knew you'd be at that table." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when two people are both arriving at the same serious place. "Daniel Brooks," Richard said. It wasn't a question. "I'm not accusing anyone," she said carefully. "I'm telling you what I observed." He stiffened when I switched the glass. Not out of surprise. Out of recalculation. Richard's jaw shifted very slightly. "He's been my CFO for 4 years." "I understand that," she said. She left the restaurant that evening carrying more than she'd walked in with. Her phone buzzed as she turned the corner onto the street toward the bus stop. An unknown number, a message that read only 7 words. "You switched the wrong glass. Be careful." She stopped walking. Read it again. Looked up and down the street. She walked the rest of the way to the bus stop without slowing down, but everything inside her was moving very fast. Someone knew what she'd done. Someone had her number. Someone was watching. She sat on the bus going home and thought about her daughter, about the school pickup the next morning, about whether she had made a terrible mistake by getting involved. She thought about her father, who had made the choice to speak up once and had lived with consequences she was still carrying. She didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, while she was walking Zuri to school, she noticed the gray car. It was parked half a block down from her building. Nothing unusual about a gray car on a city street, but it had been there when she'd come home the previous night. And it was still there now, same spot, engine quiet. She didn't stare at it. She held Zuri's hand and kept walking and laughed at something Zuri said about her teacher's new haircut. But she memorized the plate number. That afternoon, she called Richard Hale on the number he'd left her. "Someone texted me," she said when he picked up, "the night of our meeting. They know what I did at the table." A pause. "Send me the number." "There's also a car," she said. "Gray sedan. Been outside my building since yesterday evening." Another pause, longer this time. "I don't want to involve you further in this," he said. "But I also can't pretend you're not already in it." "I'm already in it," she confirmed. She looked out her apartment window at the street. "I need to know what this is actually about." He told her about the acquisition deal, the one he'd blocked 3 months ago. A major infrastructure play that would have folded 3 companies into one dominant entity. Richard had opposed it, loudly and publicly, citing monopolistic concerns and financial irregularities in the target company's books. The deal had collapsed. The man who'd architected it, Victor Langford, a well-connected competitor in the investment space, had lost an enormous amount of projected value and a significant amount of face. "Langford," she said. "He's charming," Richard said. "Public image is very carefully maintained and very private about who he actually works with." "And Daniel Brooks?" "Brooks interacts with Langford's firms on financial matters," Richard said. "I've known for months there was a closeness there I didn't fully understand. I chose to trust his track record." She was quiet for a moment. "Someone is suppressing the story," she said. "The news coverage, it's been steered." "Yes," he said. "That's not something a CFO does alone." "No," he said. "It's not." She sat with that. Outside, she heard the sound of children in the courtyard of the building across the street. Ordinary afternoon sounds. "I have a daughter," she said. "She's 6. Whatever you're offering me in terms of help or protection, I need to know it's real and not just something you're saying because you feel responsible." He was quiet. When he spoke, his voice was measured, but without the corporate distance she'd heard in it before. "I have resources that you don't have. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm telling you that if you want to step back completely, I understand. And if you don't, I will make sure you and your daughter are protected. Not because I feel guilty, because you made a decision that cost you safety, and that deserves an honest response." She thought about the text message, about the gray car, about Zuri asking about her forehead. She thought about the choice between stepping back and being the kind of person who stepped back. "All right," she said, "but I don't work for you, and I don't answer to you. If we're doing this, it's because we're both trying to get to the truth. That's all I want," he said. She wasn't entirely sure she believed him yet, but she believed that he believed it. And right now, that was enough to move forward on. She hung up the phone and looked out the window again. The gray car was gone. That didn't make her feel better. It just meant they were more careful than she'd hoped. She walked to her kitchen, made Zuri's favorite pasta for dinner, laughed at her daughter's story about recess, and quietly, privately, started planning her next steps. She wasn't sure yet where they led, but she knew she wasn't stopping. The offer Richard made was framed carefully, and Naomi appreciated that. It wasn't charity dressed up as employment. It was a role in the corporate hospitality division of Hale Ventures, event coordination support, guest services management for private dinners and internal functions. The kind of role that had a real job description, a real salary, and a real reason for her to be inside the building. The fact that it also kept her close, kept her visible, kept her under the roof of a security apparatus that could respond quickly. That part was understood between them without being said aloud. She accepted, not without reservation, but she accepted. The Hale Ventures offices occupied the upper 12 floors of a glass tower downtown, and walking into the lobby on her first morning felt like crossing into a different atmosphere entirely. Everything moved faster here, not chaotically, but with the particular velocity of people who were paid to make consequential decisions quickly. Naomi wore a fitted navy blazer she'd bought secondhand the year before. She carried herself the way she always did, straight, unhurried, aware. She was introduced to the hospitality team by a woman named Claire, who was polished and professional and whose eyes moved over Naomi in a way that managed to be evaluating without being overtly rude. Naomi had been evaluated by experts. She let pass. The first 3 days were quiet. She learned the building, the rhythms of the floor, who took lunch early, who stayed late. She listened more than she spoke, and she started to notice things. On the 4th day, she was in the small kitchen area on the executive floor when she caught the tail end of a conversation between 2 men from the finance team. Not arguing, but speaking in a low, deliberate way that meant they didn't want to be overheard. She wasn't trying to listen. She was making coffee. But she was Naomi Carter, and the words restructuring schedule and the Langford side accounts reached her before the men noticed her and stopped. They smiled politely. She smiled back. She finished making her coffee and left. That afternoon, she passed Daniel Brooks in the corridor near the executive conference room. She had seen him only briefly since the restaurant night, once in passing when Richard had introduced her to the wider senior team. Daniel had been smooth about it, warm even. He'd welcomed her to the team with what sounded like genuine friendliness, said he hoped she'd find the transition from hospitality to corporate comfortable, and moved on. Nothing in his face had flickered. But in the corridor that afternoon, walking past her with a phone to his ear, he caught her eye and held it for just a moment longer than necessary. Not threatening, just measuring. She kept walking, but she thought about it for the rest of the day. Petra called her that evening. "People are talking," Petra said. "At the restaurant. There's a rumor going around that you made the whole thing up. That you switched the glasses yourself to cause drama. Get attention." Naomi sat on her kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet because Zuri was asleep in the bedroom, and she didn't want to pace and risk waking her. "Who's saying that?" "Nobody's claiming it directly," Petra said. "It's just spreading. Started a couple days ago. Gerald's being tight-lipped, but some of the staff are uncomfortable. Someone wants to make me look unreliable," Naomi said. "I know," Petra said. "I just wanted you to know." She sat with that after the call. The rumor was deliberate. Someone was running a quiet campaign to preemptively discredit her, which meant they knew she was a threat, which meant they were paying closer attention to her than she'd realized. She was 3 weeks into the new role when she saw the light. She'd come back to the office late, past 8 in the evening, because she'd left a folder of event notes she needed on her desk. The floor was mostly empty. She took the elevator up, walked through the dim corridor toward the hospitality team area, and as she passed the hallway leading to Richard's office wing, she saw the thin line of light under his office door. She almost walked past. Then she stopped. Richard was in London. She knew this because the travel calendar was part of her remit. She helped coordinate logistics for executive travel. He'd flown out that morning. His office should have been dark and locked. She stood in the corridor for a moment. The building's low, ambient hum moved around her. Then she turned and walked back toward the elevator, pulling out her phone. She sent Richard a short message. "Are you in the building tonight?" His reply came in under 2 minutes. "No. Landed in London an hour ago." "Why?" She described what she'd seen. He called her immediately. "Don't approach," he said. His voice was controlled but sharp. "Go down to the lobby. Tell building security there's an unauthorized presence on the executive floor. Don't use my name. Just say you noticed a light in a secure office." She did exactly that. Security went up. By the time they reached the floor, the light was gone. The office door was locked. No one was found. But when Richard's assistant reviewed access logs the following morning, there was a gap. A 6-minute window where the electronic record showed no entry, but the door sensor log showed a brief interruption that could only mean the door had been opened. Someone had a key card that wasn't in the system. Richard called her from London. "Good catch," he said. "Someone knows how to move in your building without leaving a record," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's not an outside job. That's someone with inside access." She thought about Daniel Brooks moving through the executive corridor with the ease of someone who belonged there, which he did, legitimately, which made it nearly impossible to prove. It was on a Wednesday afternoon, about a month after she'd started, that Naomi saw Richard outside the building for the first time outside of a formal context. She was leaving later than usual, waiting near the building entrance for a ride share, when Richard came out with his jacket over his arm. He stopped when he saw her and said he was heading to pick up his daughter. She'd gone still for a moment before he caught himself and said, a friend child I'm responsible for tonight." The correction was awkward in a way she wouldn't have expected from him. Then Zuri, who Naomi had brought in for an hour while she wrapped up some work, because the babysitter had canceled and Richard had personally said she was welcome to use the small conference room, came running from the lobby door and grabbed Naomi's hand and announced she was hungry. Richard looked at Zuri with the kind of expression that moves across a person's face when something unexpectedly real has happened. Naomi watched him look at her daughter and saw something loosen in him that she hadn't seen before. Zuri, who had no sense of who he was except that he was her mother's boss, looked up at him and said he was very tall. He laughed, genuinely, not performatively. And for a few minutes, standing on the sidewalk in the early evening, something about the situation was simply human. He told her later, during a brief check-in, that he'd lost a child, a daughter, years ago. He didn't elaborate and she didn't push. But she filed it carefully, not as leverage, not as a detail, but as the kind of information that explained a person. She'd been reviewing event vendor files as part of her official role when she found the irregularity. She almost missed it. It was buried in 3 layers of spreadsheet cross-referencing, the kind of work she'd given herself to do thoroughly because it was the right way to do a job. A vendor account listed under an event logistics subsidiary that didn't correspond to any event on the calendar. The payments were routed through a holding company with a name that sounded like any of a dozen legitimate entities. But the subsidiary address was a mail forwarding service, and the account had been active for 14 months, drawing quarterly transfers that totaled just over $900,000. She wrote the account name down on a piece of paper, photographed it, and forwarded it to Richard through the secure message channel his security team had set up for exactly this kind of communication. He confirmed within 24 hours. The holding company connected through 2 layers of shell structures to a financial firm in Langford's broader network. Money was moving, and it had been moving long before the restaurant night. She was heading to her car in the parking garage beneath the building, a ground-level section she used because it was well-lit and monitored when it happened. She heard footsteps behind her that were moving faster than the casual pace of someone heading to their car. She felt the change in air pressure before she fully processed the sound. She turned quickly, and a man in a dark jacket was close, too close, moving toward her with a specific intent that isn't accidental. She threw herself sideways between 2 parked cars and shouted, loud, deliberate, the kind of shout that cuts through parking garage acoustics. The man hesitated. A couple walking to their vehicle 30 feet away turned toward the sound. The man in the dark jacket changed direction and walked fast toward the far exit. She stood between the parked cars with her heart running hard and loud in her chest. Building security reviewed the footage afterward. The man's face was partially obscured by his collar and the camera angle. They got a partial image, enough to know he was male, broad-shouldered, unfamiliar to the building's regular traffic log. Richard wanted to upgrade her security immediately. She said no to a full detail. It would raise too many questions and make Zuri's routine impossible. But she agreed to a check-in protocol, daily, and to varying her route from the building. Richard called a meeting of his senior security director 2 days after the garage incident. She wasn't in the room, but his assistant told her afterward that he'd come out looking like a man who had arrived at a conclusion he hadn't wanted to reach. That evening, he sat across from her in the small corner office she'd been given and said, I think someone on the inside is involved. Not just Daniel. Someone with enough access to coordinate logistics. The after-hours office access, she said. In the garage. That wasn't random. She nodded. She'd been thinking the same thing for a week, but she'd waited to say it until he arrived there himself. There's footage, he said, from a week before the restaurant dinner. Surveillance from the wine storage area adjacent to the Aurelius service corridor. He paused. Daniel is in it. She didn't react immediately. She let the statement settle. Where exactly? She asked. Near the storage entrance. The timestamp puts him there 90 minutes before the dinner. She was quiet for a moment. That's significant, she said. But it's not alone enough. I know, he said. She looked at him. It could be used on you, she said. If someone planted it. He held her gaze. That thought has crossed my mind. Then we need more before we move, she said. He nodded once. And she could see in the way he held himself that he was carrying the weight of 4 years of trust alongside the weight of what the footage suggested, and that neither of those things was easy. She went home that night and checked the locks twice. Zuri was already asleep. Naomi stood in the doorway of her daughter's room for a long moment, watching her breathe. Then she went to her own room, sat on the edge of her bed, and started writing down everything she knew in careful, ordered notes. Not on her phone, on paper. The kind of record that existed in only one place. She wasn't sure yet where this was going, but she was beginning to understand how large it was. 3 days after Richard told Naomi about the surveillance footage, he called Daniel Brooks into his office. Naomi knew about the meeting in advance. She'd helped Richard think through the approach. Not confrontation, not accusation, but a careful probe. The goal was to read Daniel's response. Not to force a confession. Richard had built his career on reading rooms and reading people. He knew how to do this. She sat in her office down the hall, and worked on event files she wasn't really processing and waited. It lasted 40 minutes. When Richard's assistant let her know the meeting was done, she gave it another 20 minutes before walking past Richard's office on an ordinary errand. He caught her eye through the glass panel and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. She understood. Daniel had denied everything, and he'd done it well. Richard recounted it to her that evening. Daniel had been surprised, then concerned, then quietly, convincingly hurt. He'd said he understood why the footage looked alarming and then immediately offered an explanation. He'd been at Aurelius earlier that week with a client for a different engagement. He'd gone into the service area looking for a manager because the client had a severe allergy and Daniel had wanted a flag in advance. He produced the client's name from memory, unprompted. He'd said he wished Richard had come to him first rather than having surveillance reviewed without his knowledge. And then he'd said, carefully, without accusation, that if someone was trying to create suspicion between the two of them, perhaps they should both be asking why. He was good, Richard said. He's had time to prepare, Naomi said. Whether or not he knew specifically what footage existed, he knew this conversation was coming. He mentioned you, Richard said. She looked at him. What did he say? He said he was concerned that an outside person with unknown motivations had been brought into the company. He said it gently, framed as worry rather than accusation. Richard paused. He said we should consider the possibility that the restaurant incident was staged and that the person who staged it is now inside the building. She didn't flinch. She'd been expecting something like this. And what did you say? She asked. I said I would consider every possibility, Richard said, which is technically true. She nodded slowly. Good. Don't let him know where you stand yet. The week that followed was strange in the way that highly charged situations can become. Outwardly ordinary, inwardly full of pressure. Victor Langford appeared on a morning financial news program and spoke warmly about Richard Hale. He called him a visionary, a steady hand in volatile markets, someone the industry respected. He mentioned, with what sounded like genuine feeling, that he hoped the recent difficulties surrounding the restaurant incident hadn't been too disruptive. He used the word friend twice. He looked directly into the camera when he said it. Naomi watched the clip on her phone at her desk and thought about the specific skill it takes to perform goodwill convincingly when you mean none of it. It was Petra who surfaced the next thread. Petra had stayed close to Naomi through everything, and Naomi trusted her in the measured, practical way she trusted most people, carefully and specifically. Petra called her to say that a member of the Aurelius floor staff, a young man named Travis who'd worked there for 8 months, had stopped showing up. No notice, no response to messages. Gerald had filed a missing persons report after 4 days. Travis was the assistant who had worked the service area on the night of the dinner. He was one of the people who could have given a fuller account of what happened near the wine staging station that evening. Naomi told Richard. He passed it to his security contact, who passed it to a law enforcement connection. Travis was found 4 days later in another city, staying at a motel under a different name. He was safe. He was also very reluctant to talk, in the way that people are reluctant when they've been told clearly that talking will cost them something significant. The board of Hale Ventures called Richard in for an emergency session that same week. Naomi wasn't there, but Richard related to her afterward with the flatness of someone describing something they found insulting but unsurprising. 3 board members had expressed concern about reputational risk. The investigation was creating instability. The stock had dipped 6 points in 2 weeks. They wanted it resolved or shelved. Richard had told them he would consider their concerns. What that meant in practice, Naomi was beginning to understand, was that the window for finding real evidence was closing. It was on a Friday evening. Zuri had been at school. Naomi had been at the office. Everything was ordinary when her phone buzzed with a text from Zuri's after-school care supervisor. Zuri mentioned something unsettling. A man outside approached her near the gate, asking if her mom worked at the tall building downtown. We asked her to describe him. She said he was wearing a gray jacket. She's safe. She's with us. Just wanted you to know. Naomi was out of her chair before she'd finished reading the message. She was in the car in 4 minutes. She called Richard on the way, one hand on the wheel, voice controlled. Zuri, she said, someone spoke to my daughter outside her school. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Is she safe? Yes. She's with the school staff. I'm sending someone there right now, he said. Don't go alone. She went anyway, because that was her daughter and nothing was going to make her wait. Zuri was in the after-school room coloring when Naomi arrived. Calm in the way 6-year-olds are calm when they don't fully understand why the adults around them have become tense. She looked up when she saw Naomi and said, "Hi, Mama," like it was any other afternoon. Naomi sat beside her and held her hand and managed to smile. She described the man to the supervisor, gray jacket, asked about her mom, hadn't touched her, walked away when the gate monitor came outside. The supervisor was apologetic and shaken. Naomi thanked her. One of Richard's people arrived 12 minutes later, a woman named Sandra, quiet and efficient, who positioned herself near the entrance without making a scene. That evening, back at the apartment with Zuri in the bath, Naomi stood in the hallway and let herself feel the full weight of the past several weeks for a few minutes. Not as despair, not as regret, just as reality that needed to be acknowledged before it could be managed. She thought about stepping back. She ran the scenario honestly. If she walked away now, if she told Richard she was done, what happened? The threat didn't disappear. She and Zuri were already known, already documented in someone's operation. Stepping back didn't make that go away. It just meant she stopped having any influence over what happened next. She gave herself 10 minutes to sit with the fear. Then she went to help Zuri dry her hair. Richard came to the apartment the following evening. He didn't call first. He texted, asking if it was okay, and she said yes. He arrived with a bag of groceries because he'd remembered her mentioning that Zuri loved chicken soup, and he hadn't known what else to bring. It was the kind of gesture that was either calculated or genuine, and Naomi had spent enough time around calculated people to know the difference. They sat at her kitchen table after Zuri was asleep. He told her he was sorry. She told him she didn't need him to be sorry. She needed him to be effective. He agreed to a more active protection arrangement for Zuri's school route. He also told her that his security team had obtained additional footage from a different camera angle, a backup system that the primary installer hadn't removed when the restaurant updated its main security. The new footage showed the service cellar entrance from a different angle. And in that footage, there was someone else. Before Daniel. A figure, obscured but present, entering the cellar more than 2 hours before Daniel's appearance on the main footage. Someone wearing a service contractor jacket. Can they enhance it? Naomi asked. They're working on it, Richard said. She looked at him across her kitchen table. This isn't just Daniel, she said. No, he said. It isn't. She thought about Langford's smooth television appearance, about the holding company payments, about Travis hiding in a motel in another city under a different name, about the gray car that had appeared and disappeared outside her building, about the careful, deliberate way this entire thing had been constructed. Someone built this over a long time, she said. The restaurant wasn't improvised. It was planned. Daniel was a piece of it, but not the top of it. That's what I think too, Richard said. She nodded once. Then she said the thing she'd been sitting on for a week. My father, she said, testified against a financial firm 15 years ago. Corporate fraud, buried accounts, money routed through structures very similar to what we found in those vendor files. She paused. The case was eventually dismissed. The primary subject of the investigation walked away clean. Richard was very still. That firm had ties to several entities that are now part of Langford's network, she said. I only realized it last week when I was cross-referencing old financial news. I could be wrong about the connection, but I don't think I am. He said nothing for a moment. Then, your father's testimony, was he protected? No, she said. Not well. He held her gaze. You will be, he said. She didn't look away. You keep saying that. I keep meaning it, he said. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities do at night. Moving, lit, indifferent. Naomi wrapped her hands around a cup of tea and thought about how far she was from the Thursday night she'd simply switched a glass and given a calm nod to a man who was watching her across a restaurant table. She was in it now, completely in it. The only direction that made sense was forward. The corporate event was scheduled for a Thursday, a private investor dinner hosted by Hale Ventures in the building's top-floor reception suite. 80 guests, catered formal seating. Naomi had been coordinating it for 2 weeks as part of her official role. She knew the layout better than anyone. That was exactly why she caught it. She was doing a final walkthrough of the seating chart on the Monday before the event when something stopped her. Table 6 was positioned near the east window, closest to the catering service corridor. It was also adjacent to the ventilation return panel, the large decorative grate set into the wall that cycled air through the reception suite. Standard building infrastructure completely invisible to guests. Naomi stood in front of table 6 and looked at the seating card placed at the chair closest to the grate. Her name was on it. She stood very still for a moment. Her name shouldn't have been on any seat. She was coordinating the event, not attending it as a guest. She was supposed to be moving through the room, managing logistics. She photographed the seating chart. Then she crouched down near the ventilation grate and looked at it closely without touching anything. She couldn't see anything wrong with it. But she thought about the chemical smell she'd caught in a glass of wine 6 weeks ago. She thought about what someone with access to building infrastructure and a reason to want her frightened or silenced might be able to do with a ventilation return positioned 18 inches from where she'd be sitting for 3 hours. She didn't touch anything. She stood up, walked calmly back to her office, closed the door, and called Richard. He picked up on the second ring. I need you to have your security team look at the ventilation panel near table 6 in the reception suite before Thursday, she said. And I need to know who modified the seating chart in the last 48 hours. There was a brief pause. What did you find? My name on a seat I was never supposed to occupy, she said, right next to the ventilation return. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll have a team up there in an hour. Don't go back in until they've cleared it. The security team found it late that afternoon. A small aerosol dispersal device, professionally installed inside the ventilation return housing, designed to release on a timer. The compound inside was identified by the building's contracted specialist as a concentrated irritant, not lethal in the doses configured, but capable of causing respiratory distress severe enough to require hospitalization. Enough to hurt her seriously. Enough to be a warning that could not be ignored. Naomi sat in Richard's office when he told her and felt something clarify inside her. Not fear. She'd been managing fear for weeks. Something more specific than that. The plan had never been just to silence Richard. Someone had been watching her since the restaurant. They'd assessed her. They decided she was a problem that needed its own solution. This was meant to hurt you, Richard said. He was standing at the window with his back to the view, which she noticed because she'd learned that he stood that way when he was angry enough to need something to lean his weight into. This wasn't a coincidence. I know, she said. Naomi, I'm not stepping back, she said, before he could finish whatever he was going to say. I want to be clear about that. I thought about it after Zuri's school. I made my decision. This doesn't change it. He looked at her for a moment. Okay, he said. What it changes, she said, is that I need Zuri somewhere safe until this is resolved. Not just a check-in protocol. Somewhere else. He nodded. I'll arrange it. Zuri went to stay with Naomi's cousin in a neighboring state the following day. Naomi drove her there herself, spent the night, made her favorite breakfast in the morning, and told her it was a special visit because she'd been working very hard and wanted Zuri to have some fun time with family. Zuri accepted this with her usual combination of perception and grace. She hugged Naomi longer than usual when they said goodbye, which told Naomi her daughter knew more than she was saying. 6 years old and already reading rooms. Naomi drove back alone and felt the specific silence of a car with an empty back seat. She pushed it down and focused. On Wednesday, 2 days after the ventilation device was found, Zuri called her in the evening. She was telling Naomi about a game she played with her cousin's dog when she stopped mid-sentence and said, Mama, that gray car. It was outside our building again this morning. Naomi frowned. Baby, you're not at our building. You're at Aunt Renee's. No, Zuri said patiently, with the confidence of a child who knows what she saw. When you dropped me off, yesterday, before you left, the gray car was on the street. I saw it from the upstairs window. Naomi's stomach went tight. Zuri had seen the car. At Renee's address. They had followed her there. She kept her voice calm for the rest of the call, told Zuri she loved her, said good night. Then she sat on the edge of the motel bed she'd stayed in before driving back and thought hard and fast. Someone had followed them, which meant they knew about Renee, which meant the safe distance she'd tried to create wasn't as safe as she'd thought. She called Richard immediately. He arranged for a security presence at Renee's address within the hour and moved Zuri to a more secure location the following morning, one that wasn't traceable through Naomi's known contacts. Naomi didn't sleep that night. The next morning, running on coffee and the particular alertness that comes from controlled adrenaline, she went back to work. She pulled the internal event coordination record for the reception suite and started tracing who had accessed the digital seating file in the 72 hours before she'd found it changed. 3 names had accessed it. 2 were members of her own team. She knew their patterns, their roles, their reasons for being in those files. The 3rd was a building facilities account, a contractor designation. She cross-referenced the contractor ID against the building's vendor records. It matched an event services company that had worked with Hale Ventures for 3 years. Routine, unexceptional. She almost moved past it. Then she pulled the company's primary contact information and compared it against the corporate hospitality database she'd been building since her first week. The contact name rang a quiet, specific bell. She'd seen it before, not in a Hale Ventures file. In the financial cross-referencing she'd done 6 weeks ago, the vendor records tied to the shell company payments. The same name appeared as a listed representative in a subsidiary connected to one of Langford's holding entities. The contractor who'd modified the seating chart was tied to Langford. She wrote it all down carefully. Then she sent it to Richard through their secure channel with a single line. The facilities contractor who changed my seating. He connected to Langford's network through the same shell structure as the vendor payments. This is the same operation. Richard's reply came within minutes. I'll have my legal team on it tonight. She set her phone face down on her desk and exhaled slowly. She was getting closer. She could feel it the way you feel a current underwater, not visible but present and moving. She just needed to stay above it long enough to get to the other side. The footage enhancement came back on a Tuesday morning, and Richard called her into his office before 9. She sat across from him and looked at the still image on his laptop screen. The figure from the cellar footage, the one who had entered before Daniel, the one wearing a contractor jacket, was still partially obscured. But the jacket was now readable. A logo, faint but present, embroidered on the left chest. A company name. It matched the event services contractor she'd already connected to Langford's network. The same contractor who had modified her seating at the Thursday event. The same contractor who had access to Hale Ventures building systems under a 3-year vendor agreement. The same contractor whose representative name appeared in Langford's shell company records. The thread was complete, or close enough to complete that what remained was a matter of documentation, not discovery. He's been inside your operation for 3 years, Naomi said, looking at the image. Langford didn't improvise the restaurant. He built access. He put someone in place and waited for the right moment. Richard closed the laptop slowly. I've been doing business in this industry for 15 years, he said. I've had competitors. I've had difficult negotiations. I've never, he stopped. You blocked his deal, she said. And you were right too, which is what made you a target rather than just an obstacle. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was neither the composure nor the careful warmth she'd seen from him. It was older than both. My father used to say that the most dangerous person in a room isn't the one who's angry. It's the one who's decided something. Langford decided, she said. Yes. The week that followed brought Victor Langford back into public view with renewed energy. He attended 2 industry events, gave a long interview to a financial publication in which he spoke about market ethics and the importance of clean competition, and posted a photograph from a charity luncheon with a caption about community investment. He looked, in every public appearance, like a man with nothing to hide and every reason to be visible. Naomi watched each appearance with the attention she'd learned to give to things that were trying hard to seem unremarkable. It was during this period that she went back further. Not into the corporate records. She'd exhausted those threads for now. She went into older public records, newspaper archives, court filings that had been available for 15 years, but that nobody had thought to connect to the present situation. Her father's name was Raymond Carter. He had worked as an accounts examiner for a mid-sized financial auditing firm in this city. In the early years of the previous decade, he had identified and internally reported a pattern of fraudulent account routing through a network of shell subsidiaries. When the firm failed to act, he had taken his documentation to a federal investigator. The case had gone forward. It had collapsed during the evidentiary phase when 3 key documents were ruled inadmissible on procedural grounds. The primary subject of the investigation, a financial officer at the center of the scheme, had walked away without charge. Raymond Carter had lost his job within 6 months. The firm terminated his contract, citing performance restructuring. He had died 4 years later. Heart failure. He was 51. Naomi had been 17. She sat with the archived records spread across her screen and felt the weight of it the way you feel something you've carried for so long that you forget it has a shape until you put it down and look at it. Then she looked at the name of the financial officer who had walked away from the collapse case 15 years ago. He was listed in the court record as a senior partner at an investment holding firm. The firm was defunct now, dissolved 8 years ago. But its successor entity, the company that had absorbed its remaining assets and client relationships, was one of the foundational pillars of Victor Langford's current financial network. Her father had gone up against the same structure 15 years before the restaurant, before Naomi had ever set foot in Aurelius. Before any of this had started, she sat in her office with the door closed and let herself feel it fully for a few minutes. Grief and fury in equal measure, and underneath both of them, something hard and clear. She messaged Richard, "I need to show you something tonight." Not through the secure channel. In person. He came to her apartment that evening. She showed him the records laid out on her kitchen table, walked him through the chain, her father's case, the collapse prosecution, the successor entity, the connection to Langford's foundational network structure. He read everything carefully, twice, without interrupting. When he looked up, his expression was not one she'd seen from him before. "This has been his pattern," Richard said. "Not just with your father. He insulates himself with structural distance and then waits out anyone who comes close." "My father couldn't hold on long enough," she said. "He didn't have resources or protection. The case collapsed, and he had no ground left to stand on." Richard was quiet for a long moment. "You do," he said. "You have both." She looked at him. "Don't make promises on someone else's behalf just to make me feel better right now." "I'm not," he said simply, and she believed him. 2 days later, at the annual Whitfield Foundation Charity Gala, a black-tie event that drew most of the city's financial and civic leadership, Naomi attended as part of the Hale Ventures table. It was Richard's suggestion, and she'd agreed to it deliberately. Langford would be there. She wanted to see him in person. She wore a deep green dress she'd borrowed from a friend, kept her presence quiet, and moved through the room with the same professional ease she'd moved through Aurelius for 3 years. She introduced herself to no one important. She listened at the edges of conversations. She watched. Langford worked the room beautifully. He was everything his public image promised: warm, engaged, generous with his attention. He remembered names. He laughed at the right moments. He radiated the particular confidence of a man who has never seriously been held accountable for anything. She was standing near the east side of the ballroom when he crossed into her vicinity. She didn't move toward him or away from him. She simply remained where she was, holding a glass of water, watching the room. He noticed her. She saw the moment he did, a barely perceptible pause in his movement before he continued his trajectory. He came within 5 feet of her as he made his way toward a group near the window. He didn't speak to her, but as he passed, their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and she watched his face carefully in that fraction. What she saw was not curiosity, not the mild interest a man shows when he notices someone unfamiliar at an event. It was the specific, tight recalibration of a person who already knows exactly who they're looking at. He knew her face. He'd known it before tonight. She kept her expression pleasant and empty and let him pass. She found Richard across the room 15 minutes later and said quietly, "He knows who I am." He's known for a while. Richard's jaw shifted. You're certain? I'm certain, she said. The gala ended at 11. Richard had his car brought around and sat in the back seat beside her for the drive home, not speaking immediately. The city moved past the windows. We need to move faster, she said. I know, he said. It was the following morning that Sandra, the security officer who had been assigned to Naomi's detail after the garage incident, was caught. A colleague had noticed her accessing the building's internal security system terminal after hours on 2 separate occasions. When reviewed, the access corresponded to deletions, not full erasures, but partial overwrites of specific surveillance file segments. The kind of deletions that created gaps. Sandra had been on Richard's security team for 2 years. She was methodical, professional, and had given no visible indication of compromise. When security leadership confronted her with the access logs, she didn't deny it. She asked for a lawyer. They had an insider. Confirmed. Naomi sat with this and felt, underneath the weight of it, a strange steadiness. Because the insider being identified meant the network was reacting. And networks react when they feel threatened, which meant they were closer than Langford knew. She drove home that evening in the quiet and thought about her father, who had stood in front of the same machine and been ground down by it. She thought about what he'd have said to her right now, sitting in this car this far in. She thought he'd have said, keep going. So that was what she did. Sandra talked on a Wednesday morning, 2 days after she'd asked for a lawyer. Not to the police. Not yet. To Richard's legal team first, in a conference room on the 22nd floor, with her attorney present and a federal investigator who had been quietly brought into the matter through a contact Richard had cultivated over many years. Sandra sat at the table with her hands folded and her face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding something heavy for too long and has finally decided to put it down. Naomi wasn't in the room. She sat in her office down the hall and waited. Richard's attorney came to find her an hour later. He was a measured man named Gerald Whitmore. Not young, not excitable, the kind of lawyer who chose his words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. He sat down across from her and said, she was approached 14 months ago, offered a financial arrangement in exchange for periodic access to surveillance systems and schedule information. She says she was told it was industrial intelligence gathering. Nothing violent. She believed that? Naomi asked. She says she did. Whether that's true, he paused. She became uncomfortable when the scope expanded. She deleted the files because she was told to, and because by that point she understood enough to be afraid of what happened to people who didn't follow through. Who approached her? A man she knew only by a first name and a phone number, Gerald Whitmore said. But she identified a photograph. The man who met with her in person, the one who gave her the initial instructions. He slid a photograph across the desk. A still from a security camera, a man in a parking structure, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of face that was designed to be forgettable. Naomi looked at it. She didn't recognize the face, but she recognized the jacket. It was the same style worn by the figure in the cellar footage. He's the contractor, she said. We believe so, Gerald Whitmore said. And Sandra confirmed that the instructions she received were detailed. Specific. More than one person was coordinating her. She believes there were at least 2 levels above the man she met with. Daniel Brooks, Naomi said. She named him as the person who sent operational instructions through an encrypted message platform. She has records, screenshots she kept, she says, as insurance. And above Daniel, he looked at her steadily. She doesn't have direct proof. But in 2 of the messages she retained, there's a reference to authorization from senior party. The language she was given to confirm compliant actions used a specific phrase, one that we've been able to trace, through our financial analysis, to the communication style used in correspondence from Langford's private office. Naomi sat back in her chair, not surprised, just resolved. The shape of it had been clear for a while. Now it had edges. How long before you move? She asked. The federal investigators need to build the case properly, Gerald Whitmore said. Days, not weeks. But there's a complication. He paused. Daniel Brooks liquidated 2 offshore accounts yesterday afternoon. He has a flight booked under an alias departing Friday morning. She looked at him. He's running. It appears so. She found Richard 10 minutes later. He was on a call, but ended it when he saw her face. She told him what Gerald Whitmore had told her. He listened without interrupting, standing behind his desk, jacket still on, the way he stood when something required his full weight. When she finished, he said, "We can't let him get on that plane. Not because of the legal complications. Those can be managed. Because if he gets out of reach, Langford walks. Daniel is the direct link. He's the thread that connects Langford to every operational piece of this." "I know," she said. "The investigators are ready to move on Daniel before Friday. But they want the confrontation documented. They want him on record." He paused. "He's requesting a meeting. He contacted me an hour ago. Says he has information about Langford that he wants to trade. He's scared, and he's looking for a deal before everything closes in." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "He'll confess to enough to implicate Langford if he thinks it saves him." "Yes," Richard said. "Then give him the meeting." She held his gaze. "And I'm attending." He started to say something. "I understand the risk," she said. "But I was there at the beginning of this. I know what I saw. Daniel knows I know. If he's going to say anything real, anything that holds, I need to be in that room. He needs to feel the full weight of what he did, not just the legal version of it." Richard looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." It was the evening before that Zuri called, and Naomi almost didn't answer because she was in the middle of reviewing documents and her mind was moving fast. She answered on the fourth ring. Mama. Bubby. How are you?" "Good. I wanted to hear your voice." A pause, small and honest. "Are you still doing the important thing?" "Almost done," Naomi said. "Almost done." Another pause. "Okay, I made a drawing for you. It's you and me and a really big tree." "I love that," Naomi said, and meant it completely. After she hung up, she sat still for a moment in the quiet of her apartment. Then she thought about her father, who had gone into a room 15 years ago with documents in good faith and had been systematically dismantled. She thought about what he hadn't had, and she thought about what she did have: evidence, support, a room full of people who were ready, and a record running before she walked through the door. She went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept better than she'd slept in weeks. The meeting with Daniel was set for Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock in a private conference room at the offices of Richard's legal firm. Neutral ground. Daniel arrived 8 minutes late, which Naomi read immediately. He was making small demonstrations of control because large control was leaving him rapidly. He looked different from the man she'd first seen at the restaurant table. Thinner, tighter, moving with the careful precision of someone who was managing himself very deliberately. He wore a good suit and a pale expression. When he saw Naomi seated at the table beside Richard, something moved across his face. Not shock, not quite, but a recalculation. A reset. He sat down across from them. His lawyers sat beside him. 2 federal investigators were present as observers, their presence acknowledged and on record. The room was recorded with Daniel's prior written consent, a condition of the meeting he'd accepted. "Daniel," Richard said. His voice was even and completely without warmth. Not hostile, just honest. Daniel looked at Richard for a moment. Then his eyes moved to Naomi. He held her gaze for a few seconds in a way that was not aggressive, more like someone looking at the specific point where everything had changed and trying to understand it. "I want to be clear about what I did and didn't do," Daniel said. "For the record." "Go ahead," Richard said. What followed took 40 minutes. Daniel spoke in the careful, structured way of a man who had rehearsed it, but was feeling the rehearsal come apart slightly as reality pushed through. He confirmed the arrangement with Langford. Not directly, he said. There had always been an intermediary, but the operational instructions had been clear. Facilitate access. Provide schedule information. Ensure Richard was vulnerable at the dinner without being directly visible in the chain. He confirmed the contractor, named him fully, the company, the contact, the method of access to the building systems. He confirmed Sandra's role and how she'd been recruited. He confirmed 2 shell company accounts and the payment structure. And then, at the 27th minute, his voice tightened and he said, "The instruction for the restaurant came from above the intermediary. I received confirmation of authorization using the specific protocol that Langford's office uses for sensitive approvals." He named a phrase. He named the date of the communication. He named the platform. His lawyer put a hand on his arm briefly. Daniel looked down at the table. Then he looked back up. I told myself it was business, he said. That it was leverage, not harm. That it would stop before it went too far. He paused. I was wrong. He looked at Richard when he said that. He didn't look at Naomi, and she noticed that, and she thought that perhaps Daniel Brooks was not entirely without conscience, just without the courage to use it until he had no other option. After the meeting ended and Daniel had been escorted out by his legal team and the federal investigators, Naomi and Richard sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes. That's enough, Richard said. That's more than enough. Yes, she said. Langford's attorneys are going to move fast. They'll try to discredit the authorization phrase, challenge the communication records. They'll fail, she said, not because of any one piece, because of all of it together. The contractor, Sandra, the shell accounts, the seller footage, the vendor payments. She paused. My father's case records connecting the predecessor network. It's a 15-year pattern, and it's documented. Richard was quiet. Then he said, You should have been a lawyer. She looked at him. I should have been a nurse, she said. That's still the plan. Victor Langford was arrested on a Friday morning, the same morning Daniel's flight had been scheduled to depart, at his office building by federal agents. It was handled without spectacle. No press was present. No perp walk. Just a quiet professional action in a lobby that Langford had walked through 10,000 times, believing himself untouchable. Naomi heard about it from Richard by text at 7:43 in the morning while she was making coffee. She stood in her kitchen and read the message twice. Then she set her phone down and finished making her coffee and sat at the table and looked at the window and let the morning be ordinary for a few minutes. She had earned ordinary. The story broke publicly on a Monday, and when it did, it broke completely. The financial press led with the structural elements, the shell company network, the 15-year pattern of regulatory evasion, the embedded contractor operation inside Hale Ventures. The general press led with the human element, an attempted poisoning at an upscale restaurant, a waitress who had noticed what no one else had, a conspiracy that reached from a corporate boardroom down to a service corridor. The framing that had been carefully constructed in the first hours after the restaurant incident. The food contamination story, the supplier issue, the clinical language designed to produce no follow-up questions, unraveled publicly and completely within 48 hours. The reporters who had first covered the story walked it back with varying degrees of grace. Naomi did not speak to press. She had a single statement prepared by Richard's communications team, approved by her, that confirmed her role and said she was grateful for the support she'd received. That was all. Frederick Owens, the man who had collapsed at the restaurant 6 weeks ago, gave a brief interview from his home after his full recovery. He said he held no bitterness. He said he was glad the truth had come out. He thanked the staff at Aurelius without naming Naomi specifically, respecting the boundary she'd communicated through proper channels. Travis, the Aurelius floor assistant who had disappeared and been found in another city, gave a formal statement to investigators. He had been approached and financially coerced into silence within 3 days of the restaurant incident. He hadn't known the full scope of what he was being paid not to discuss, just that someone very serious wanted him to say nothing about the service area that evening. His account corroborated the timeline. It held. Daniel Brooks entered a cooperative agreement with federal prosecutors. His sentencing would reflect his cooperation and his partial confession. His career was finished, his reputation dismantled, his name attached permanently to a story he had believed he could control. He had wanted money and advancement and had gotten neither. He had also wanted, somewhere underneath all of it, the feeling of being consequential. He had achieved that in precisely the worst way. Naomi thought about him occasionally in the weeks that followed. Not with sympathy exactly, but without the pure anger she'd expected to feel. He had been a person who'd made a series of choices, each one a little darker than the last, each one a little easier to justify, because the previous one hadn't ended him. She understood the architecture of that kind of moral erosion, even as she found it entirely inexcusable. Victor Langford's legal team was expensive and aggressive and delayed the formal indictment by several weeks through procedural challenges. But the documentation was too layered, too cross-corroborated, too connected to a pattern that now stretched back 15 years with her father's case newly and formally reopened as supporting evidence. The challenges bought time. They didn't change the destination. Langford was indicted on 8 counts. He would spend years in litigation before trial. But he would never again walk into a room the way he had walked into rooms before, with the easy, unguarded confidence of a man who believed consequences were for other people. Naomi considered that a sufficient result for now. Aurelius reopened 6 weeks after the incident, with new management and a full staff review. Gerald, the manager who had handled the night of the collapse, was cleared of involvement but stepped back voluntarily. The restaurant recovered slowly, the way places do when they've been associated with something frightening. First, the regulars returned, then new guests drawn by curiosity, then over time, it simply became a restaurant again. Naomi went back on a quiet Tuesday evening in February. She sat at the bar rather than a table, had a glass of sparkling water and the mushroom risotto that had always been her favorite thing on the menu, and let the room be what it was: warm, unhurried, full of ordinary people having ordinary evenings. Petra was working. She came over during a slow moment, and they talked for 20 minutes, the way they used to, about nothing important, about the risotto and a movie Petra had seen and Zuri's current obsession with a particular book series. Normal conversation, the kind that requires no courage. Walking out, Naomi paused for a moment just inside the front door. The dining room was behind her, the street ahead. She stood in the threshold and thought about the Thursday night she had poured wine here, noticed a smell and a residue in a man's careful eyes, and made a quiet decision in 4 seconds that had changed everything that followed. She didn't think of it as heroism. She thought of it as what she'd known how to do, applied at the right moment. That was all it ever was. She pushed through the door and walked out into the evening. 2 weeks later, Richard called her. Not through the secure channel that had been dismantled, its purpose fulfilled. Just a regular call on a regular afternoon. "I want to tell you something," he said, before the formal offer goes through legal channels. "Okay," she said. "The Hale Foundation is establishing a scholarship program," he said. "Healthcare and medical education, targeted at students who've had their training interrupted by circumstance. It's funded for 20 years initially." A pause. "You're the first recipient if you want it. Full program, your choice of institution, an income supplement for Zuri's care during your studies." She sat down on the kitchen chair slowly. "I'm not doing this because I owe you," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm doing it because you had a path that mattered, and it was disrupted by things outside your control, and you've demonstrated more than enough evidence that you would use the education well." She was quiet for a moment. "I'll think about it," she said. "Take the time you need," he said. "There's no deadline." She thought about it for 3 days. She thought about her father and the path he'd tried to walk and what it had cost him. She thought about Zuri and what it meant to show her daughter that interrupted didn't mean finished. She thought about what she'd learned in 2 years of nursing school and then carried in her body for 6 more without a formal context to apply it in, until one evening in a restaurant when it had mattered enormously. She called Richard back on the 4th day. "I accept," she said. She heard something in the brief silence before he responded that was not professional satisfaction. It was something quieter and more genuine than that. "Good," he said. Zuri's school held its spring presentations on a Thursday morning in March. Parents sat in small chairs that were absolutely not designed for adult bodies and watched their children stand at the front of the classroom and present a project on the theme of people we admire. Zuri had been working on hers for 2 weeks. She had made a poster with careful, slightly lopsided lettering and a drawing that Naomi recognized as the two of them standing in front of a building that Zuri had color blue because she said it looked more interesting that way. Zuri stood at the front of the class in a yellow dress and held her poster and spoke with the complete unself-conscious confidence of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid of rooms. "My person is my mom," she said. "She's a waitress, and she's going to be a nurse. She's brave because she helped someone when it was scary and hard. She didn't do it because someone told her to. She saw something was wrong, and she fixed it." She paused, studying her poster for a moment. "My teacher said heroes wear capes, but I think that's wrong. My mom doesn't wear a cape. She wears an apron, and she's still a hero. The classroom was very quiet. Several parents were looking at their hands or at the ceiling in the specific way adults do when they are managing their faces. Naomi looked at her daughter and felt something that didn't have a clean name. Not pride exactly, not just love, but something that encompassed both and included something larger, something that felt like the whole complicated arc of the past months folding into this small room, this yellow dress, this lopsided poster. She clapped when Zuri finished, properly and loudly, the way Zuri would have wanted. Months later, on a morning in early summer, Naomi sat in the orientation hall of the nursing program she'd chosen. The same program she'd left years before, which had welcomed her back with something that felt close to institutional warmth. Around her, new students were finding their seats, adjusting their lanyards, looking at the room with a specific mix of excitement and nerves that belongs to beginnings. She had a notebook open in front of her, a real one, paper, the kind her father had always preferred. On the first page, in her own handwriting, she'd written a single line before she came in this morning. A thing she'd been carrying for a while and needed to put somewhere real. Sometimes saving a life starts with a silent decision, and courage grows from there. She looked at it for a moment. Then the orientation speaker took the podium, and the room settled, and Naomi Carter closed her notebook, straightened in her chair, and paid attention. She was good at that. If she had looked away, just for a second, just like everyone else did, would anyone have ever known? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe for more stories about the people the world overlooks, until the moment they can't be overlooked anymore.